Well, I am pleased to be joined for a conversation about the power of open records with Paula LaVigne. Paula is an investigative reporter at ESPN. She's also the co-author with Mark Schlabach of the 2017 book Violated, which is all about Baylor University and its response or non-response to sexual assault by college athletes. Invite you and encourage you to check that out. Paula, thanks for making time to join us. And talk a little bit first about your own work as a reporter and what brought you to work at ESPN and kind of what a typical week or month looks like for an investigative sports reporter.
Well, thank you, first of all, Frank, for the opportunity. I enjoy talking about this because I'm pretty proud of the work that we do. So I started at ESPN in 2008 as an investigative reporter. And coming to ESPN, I had never covered sports and I had never worked in television. So it seemed like an obvious choice. Somewhat, not really, but it actually fits better than it sounds. So my background is in newspapers. I had a degree in journalism and a master's in business administration, and I had been at newspapers in Missouri and Washington State and Iowa and Dallas, Texas. And I had a connection from Dallas to one of the editors at ESPN who was starting this investigative unit. And he wanted someone who also had a background in data journalism, what we used to call computer assisted reporting. And that was my background. I've been doing data journalism since I started in newspapers however long ago. And so I came and joined ESPN's enterprise unit. For many years, we were tied to the show Outside the Lines. Now we've sort of broadened that out, and we've been doing work for multiple platforms, you know, whether it's television, long form, quick turn pieces, digital presentations, podcasts. You know, we've even sort of purposed some of our stuff for Instagram and social media. And so it's every way we can get our investigative work out, we are trying to do it. So people ask me, you know, what is it that you do? Are you assigned to a beat? Are you assigned to an area? No, those of us who work in the unit, we don't have beats. We're not assigned to any sports. We're not assigned to any geography. We all sort of, though, sometimes fall into different specialties just based on some of the things that we cover. Like one of the, you know, you had mentioned the book that Mark Schlabach and I wrote on sexual assault. It, you know, over the years, along with some of my other colleagues, including a producer we have by the name of Nicole Noren, we've done a lot of work on campus sexual assault. And so I've sort of become somewhat of a go-to person on that. But I certainly don't do all the stories on sexual assault, and then that's clearly not the only thing that I do. I mean, our unit, we've tackled issues like the NFL concussion issue. We do stories on sports business. We've done a lot of stories about Olympic and professional athletes and doping, anything about fraud and corruption and financial malfeasance within colleges, within nonprofits, within professional leagues. We've done a lot in recent years with a lot of the name, image, likeness, and the rights of college athletes. And we've also done a lot with social issues, you know, and especially of late, a lot of, you know, racial injustice and addressing issues of representation and equity and whether that's with race or gender or ethnicity or so forth. So we're in all those areas. And we also do a lot of, I mentioned the sexual assault. We also are the ones who handle any issues involving athletes, coaches, team owners, and criminal activity, or, you know, lawsuits and stuff like that. All the stuff that happens off the field, that falls into our area.
So this is a great introduction, and the name Outside the Lines is so perfect for a description of what you do, because it sounds like you're covering all the stuff we don't see on the field on Sunday afternoon on our television, and that taps into your expertise in business, in knowing the legal system, in knowing the criminal justice system. All those things come into play as an investigative sports reporter. So that's a great and ideal background for you to bring to that work. And people don't probably generally think a lot about public records when they think about sports. If they think about public records at all, they probably think about lawsuits or the police department. But we should talk about the way in which open records laws, and I'm assuming you usually use state ones and not the federal one, that open records laws are tools that you incorporate into your investigative reporting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that I I count the number of public records requests I file each year in the hundreds, easily, and especially when we're dealing with colleges. And you're right in that we do generally file state open records laws, but we've filed open records, or we do file a number of FOIA requests, whether it's to the FCC or the FAA or the FBI or the Department of Justice. I mean, there are so many reasons that, well, like, for example, like the Kobe Bryant crash that started off this year that we've all forgotten about now because of how 2020 is gone. But, that was a request to the FAA, for some of the records there. So you never know in our reporting where that's going to go. I've also filed requests in Canada, routinely filed requests in Canada, in the UK. I've helped some reporters file requests in Mexico. I mean, it's all across the board. And it is, so I do a lot of that for my own work, but I've also sort of become the person that other people go to help them get the information. And you mentioned law enforcement, and that is probably the biggest requests that I get, is for people who are trying to get information on crimes or lawsuits. We make hundreds of requests to police departments for police reports, for investigative material. We do a lot of requests to colleges, for athletic departments, for everything from their financials to issues of athlete medical care. We request a lot of email correspondence. One thing, and people think, well, okay, so colleges, that's kind of where it's got to be at. Well, granted, public colleges are a gold mine, because when you talk about athletic departments, they are more subject and they have more interaction with public records than others. But when I tell people about this, I think, you think about the NFL, think about any professional league, even though they themselves are not public, they are regulated by so many public entities. And so whenever anybody asks about sports and public records, I say, let's the college athletic departments are a no-brainer, and K through 12 public schools are no-brainers and stuff. But think about every entity and how it's regulated. So one good example I give, because this is a massive public records request, and it turned into a fascinating story. We've done it twice. Is gauging food safety for the professional sports stadium. So we did this back in 2010, and we did it a couple of years ago too. We had a list of every single professional sports arena in the US and Canada. We found the corresponding health department that does their food safety inspections, and we requested all of the food safety inspections for all of the food service venues in each of those sports arenas, and then calculated like how bad they were, or how compliant they were, or how often they were doing anyhow. But that's it. And it was a fast, I mean, you can't, I always said, you can't go wrong with rat poop and dead flies. And it's always it's always a hugely popular story. But actually, even in this year, when you talk about COVID and stuff like that, it actually takes on more gravity, just knowing that these regulations are out there to protect you from things that could be really awful. But that's always a good example of how this was a story about professional sports and a regulatory body. And then this is, and it turned out into this amazing database. But we also look at, we've done some stories this year on campaign finance and athletes and athletic, sports figures and who they donate to. So we get into that arena as well. We looked recently at what athletic interests are getting PPP money. We look at, trying to think of another sort of off the wall example. Trying to think of what we've done in the UK. So most of the stuff that we've done in the UK has been criminal related. Oh, nonprofits. Yeah, we do it like, so the NCAA is a nonprofit. The major sports conferences are nonprofits. You know, they have filings, they have, you know, regulatory agencies that oversee them. So that's, you know, that's where we also get some of our records from. But yeah, that's what I mean. It's all over the map. I mean, it's almost like you covering any other industry, all the areas that they would intersect with government in terms of, you know, any sort of regulation they have to file, anything, you know, from whether it's tax financing for their stadium deal to, oh, sports gambling. That's the last one I wanted to mention. That's a huge thing right now. And with states, more and more states legalizing sports gambling, with the legalization of sports gambling in each state, you have another state commission that is subject to open records laws. And we used that this summer when David Purdom, who is our sports gambling guru, and I did a story on corrupt Russian table tennis leagues, which I know it's amazing to think that Russian table tennis wouldn't be on the up and up, but it was, you know, it was one of those sports that everyone was turning to in the pandemic. And so anyhow, but just stuff like that. It's always sort of thinking outside the box as to where you can get information, and so much of it comes from public records.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the food safety in stadiums. That's such a great example, because there were probably people watching this video who have read or listened to one of those stories about what's in your hot dog, and they didn't stop to think, you know what? There's a public records request behind there somewhere. And that's true of so much investigative journalism, that beneath the surface, if you scratch a great piece of investigative reporting, you'll so often find that there was a request, or maybe dozens of requests, for public records. So there's food safety inspection reports, and of course, courthouse records are a gold mine. Even private entities like an NFL team, like a Major League Baseball or Major League Basketball team, do get involved in litigation all the time. Their owners are some of the richest people on the face of the earth, people who are often involved in all kinds of business disputes, whether it involves their ownership of the franchise or their other side businesses. And those court records can give us a window into things that we would otherwise never have seen, because for the most part, private businesses don't have to disclose their records to the public. That makes them different from government agencies, but the courts do have to disclose. And so that enables us, through court records, through regulatory agencies, through law enforcement agencies, that can open up a window onto what these otherwise private entities are doing. So I love those tips. Now let's talk about some of the roadblocks and speed bumps and frustrations that you encounter. And you and I have had conversations about things like student privacy, about law enforcement agencies that are especially secretive about their investigative records. So I guess talk about some of the recurring issues as an investigative journalist, where maybe those laws don't always work as powerfully as they should.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. That's, yeah. As you said, as you will know, that is my, that is a daily issue for me. Yeah, I would say the FERPA, what is federal? I'm getting it right.
Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, right?
Yeah. That has been a really big thorn in our side, with colleges claiming that they can't release information to us because it violates student privacy. And I would say 80% of the time that's not true. and trying to, you know, and we've been pretty successful, I think, in navigating a lot of those, but not all of them. We deal a lot with delays, especially in states that don't have actual deadlines for complying with the request. I mean, we've had requests linger for months, several months. You know, we've had, as anyone who's dealt with the FBI lately knows, I mean, I've got requests into them that have taken more than a year, and they're not even any remotely controversial. We've had, with law enforcement, we run into a lot of denials regarding issues over privacy, over what the status is of the investigation. You know, one of the biggest requests and actual court cases we had this year was related to the murder of former Miami football player Brian Pata. And we requested the police report from the Miami-Dade Police Department, and he was murdered in 2006, and they haven't really done any work. They haven't entered anything into the police report since 2010. So we were arguing with them that they could not claim that it was an active investigation, and we sued them. And they, for the most part, prevailed on that. But that's another, that whole active investigation thing is a real barrier in states that where they're allowed to withhold because of that. So, but that applies to the police records. I mean, you know, one way we've kind of gotten around that in some cases, it was not the case here, is getting the records from the prosecutor or district attorney's office, or seeing if it ever ended up in a court case, obviously. Actually, I would say, I know we're not at that part about tips, but I would say one of the biggest tips I would give people in getting law enforcement records is to request them from the DA or the prosecutor. Because we have had a pretty interesting amount of success with doing that lately.
Yeah, that's very smart.
Yeah, when the police department either won't or believes that it can't turn it over, you know, sometimes the DA might have more incentive to do that, or more desire to do it. Who knows? Let's see, what else do we let's see, privacy. I'm trying to think of what other.
What about the cost of obtaining records?
The cost. Yeah. We've had. I will say this is really interesting. So, as I mentioned before, I make a lot of requests of college athletic departments. So a few years ago, I requested from all of the Power 5 public colleges the records showing how many Title IX complaints they had against athletes. Okay, and so most of these entities that complied with us didn't charge us anything. We had others that wanted to charge us hundreds of dollars. That's fine, whatever. You know, I mean, I understand what we were asking, how we were asking for. I understand it took some work. We had some universities that wanted to charge us in excess of $10,000. So it's funny because we've had that happen a lot. We make the exact same request of different entities, and some of them, again, I remember one in particular, one university wanted to charge us $30,000 for a request that most other universities didn't charge us a dime for. I mean, it's insane. It was to the point where I even put it in the story, like how much they wanted to charge us, because it was ridiculous. But we run into that a lot. And then the other thing, I was going to say, sometimes it's, we don't run into this a lot, but sometimes we do run into when we are requesting financial or business records, we'll have people say, well, you know, we can't, they'll invoke like a trade secrets provision, which is more of a thorn in some states than others. But yeah, it's all over the map.
Yeah, well, and so just to go back and reinforce a couple of those points, right? You identified 3 of the recurring exemptions to open government law that are habitually complained about the most by requesters because they are subject to a lot of interpretive discretion, meaning that they can be abused by an agency that wants to interpret it in the broadest manner possible to withhold the most information possible. Student privacy, active and ongoing law enforcement investigations, and business trade secrets. Those exemptions are ones that journalists, researchers, and other people who are super users of these public records laws habitually complain about. And you also mentioned 2 of the kind of structural defects and frustrations in a lot of these laws. One, many states, in fact, the majority of states, do not assign a date certain on which a response is due. They'll just direct the agencies to respond within a reasonable time. And even in the agencies that say 5 days, 10 days, they all know that no one is going to run to the courthouse and file a lawsuit on day number 11. So they really know that that 10 days is a suggestion rather than a requirement, because nothing will happen to them if they really take 13, 14, 15, 20 days to respond to you. And so that is just a fraught system, and one to which there seems to be no perfect response. Part of the reason that it is so fraught is that although there are a handful of states that have some kind of an expedited way to get a complaint resolved, for the most part, your recourse is get a lawyer, file a lawsuit, go to court, expensive, time consuming, and oftentimes, as you experienced in the Brian Peta case, not likely to result in a successful outcome because the judges will defer to the discretion of the agencies to withhold.
Right, right. And the other thing we run into a lot, and well, I'll either chalk this up to a lack of transparency or an excess of laziness, is agencies that will withhold an entire document or an entire file simply because some of the information in that document could legitimately be withheld. And we're dealing with that right now with a case out of New York. And we had a conversation the other day with the attorney, and I basically said, look, I know you're just lazy. I know you don't want to do this. I know everything's a mess right now, but like, you're going to go back. You're going to exempt the part that I know you can exempt because I'm pretty familiar with what these records are, and you're going to give us the rest. And it was, you know, I sort of got a tacit, all right, fine, you know, whatever, we'll do it. But you run into that a lot, that even if there's one part of a document, whether it's like a law enforcement record, a victim's name or a description, they'll just withhold the entire thing. And I honestly, God, do think more of that has to do with laziness than actually, you know, being afraid of what the information contains or you know, not wanting it out.
Well, and you are an especially well-educated consumer of your rights, so you are an effective advocate in a negotiation like that, and that is important to know going in what you're entitled to and what you're not. Most states have explicitly said that withholding on the grounds of confidentiality is not an all or nothing proposition. If you've got a 200-page document and 2 pages in it are confidential, then the response is what? Produce the 198 pages. That's the legally right answer, but it's always difficult to get to that answer because in this negotiation, there's one party that holds the ultimate trump card. They have the document and you don't. But let's segue into that, and this would be a good place to wrap up the conversation to talk about, you know, being a good negotiator. That's one tip for sure. Knowing your legal rights, that's a good tip for sure. What else do you tell people? You do a lot of trainings for beginning journalists and investigative reporters and those who want to be. What sort of tips and advice do you have about being a good consumer of your freedom of information rights?
Yeah, I mean, sort of going off of what you just said about knowing your rights. I mean, if you're coming at this new, and especially if you're in a situation where you're going to be working in different jurisdictions, spend some time looking at the provision of the law that pertains to what you're requesting, and realize that it's different in every single state. I mean, I run into this with editors all the time who are like, they're like, well, we want a mugshot of so-and-so. We got it for this other case. I'm like, but now the case you're asking for it in specifically says it's exempt. I mean, the laws, as you know, vary wildly from state to state in some areas. So being very familiar with what provision of the law pertains to what you're asking for is I can't emphasize that enough before you go into it. Second, I would say, and to give a little shout out to the Student Press Law Center, use a template. You know, there are some great templates out there. I still use the SPLC template for all my state requests. I have my colleagues use it. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has their iFOIA system for federal FOIA requests. But there are a lot, and some state, like there's a good one for Texas too. I'm assuming there's probably one for Florida out there as well. But yeah, I would say definitely use a template, because that communicates to the agency you're requesting from that you know what you're doing, right? So it's harder for them to just blow you off. And it establishes very formally that this is the start of your request, that the clock is ticking now, where the clock matters. And I feel like, you know, it's just, I don't know, it's just better. It's just better to do that professionally. It's better to let them know that you're doing it. The other thing, and I run into this, I don't run into this as much anymore, but I do occasionally, is when you send something to an agency, make sure you send it to someone who's supposed to get it. We ran into this early on, sometimes when we would send, when we would send something to the SID, the Sports Information Director. Well, the Sports Information Director, in some cases, does not really, I mean, like I said, this has changed, but, you know, doesn't understand that there's a legal obligation to this. So making sure that you send it to someone at the agency who knows what it is, who knows that this is, you know, that they have laws that they have to follow in responding to this is important. And also make sure that if you don't hear back within the timeline, pick up the phone and call someone. I will say in general, when it comes to making the requests, picking up the phone is probably some of the best advice that I can offer. And especially if you're going to be making a complicated request, to talk to someone ahead of time, because that gets eyes on your request. It starts the dialogue. Like I mentioned the thing we did about the requesting the records on Title IX complaints regarding student athletes. Like I knew that was going to be complicated. So in that point, I called every single university and had a conversation with the records person about, this is what we want, you know, and because a lot of times what helps when you are making a request, especially if it's something that's not straightforward, like, you know, you're requesting a contract, right? That's pretty straightforward, right? You know what the document is, you're asking for it. It's something that other people ask for. But if you're asking for something like records of emails or something that may be a little more complex, it's good to call someone ahead of time and say, okay, like, can you give me some idea of how you have this stored? Like, what is your system like? Like, how do you know, who would be most likely to be getting these emails? You know, can you give me a list of the people who work in this office? Because you're going to get, if you send in this broad request of, I want all emails sent with the keyword, you know, football for the last 5 years, that's not a legitimate request. Like that's far too broad. And so getting an idea for, okay, who do I realistically think would have these records? You know, you want to make your request specific enough, but not too narrow, because you don't want to miss something that you don't know might be there. But at the same time, again, going back to the delays, and especially what we've seen with email requests now, if you make a request out there and it's so broad, it's going to be 6 months before you get anything back. So just again, like I know, especially, I don't like making stereotypes of any millennials, but I will say it is a message to people to, like, I know we like email, I know we like texting, but my God, sometimes you just got to pick up the phone and have a conversation.
Yeah.
And also, and on the fee issue, you know, never settle for, if you think a fee is too large, do not settle for the fee. I mean, I think every single time I've argued about a fee that's been excessive, it's been brought down somewhat. Maybe not the $30,000 one, that was unusual, but in many cases, especially if you can, you know, work with them on or call them out on it, you can get the fees reduced. I think one of the last things I would say is always follow up.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that really bothers me is when someone makes a request, and sometimes this happens with some of my colleagues, and then they never follow up, and they don't, you know, they don't respond to a request for further information. They don't even respond to a fee request, and I just feel like you owe it to transparency and to your story to always follow up on whatever request you make.
Well, that's all wonderful practical advice from somebody who is a master in the field. So thank you for sharing that expert perspective to Paula LaVigne from ESPN. And thanks for the wonderful investigative work that you and your network do about the dark side of sports that we don't always get to see on the TV. So thanks.
You're welcome.